Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 7 in our prophecy series on the reception of prophecy. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast. We continue with part 7 in our series on prophecy, where we look at some of how it has been received down through the history of the text. And it's amazing how much, these prophecies and Nostradamus and these people and their ability to prophesy and say this and that and this, and it just never ends. And even those famous now, because of it's kind of a two-edged sword. The internet allows us to connect so fast, and we can get instantaneous news on our phones. Incredible. And yet you have these people who hear from God, and they spoke that God was going to curse or destroy or whatever the pandemic, and it didn't, and it's still here. And many people live in denial of the pandemic, that there is no pandemic and there's no concern. Wherever you fall on that, there are scientists that see God in all this technology that has been used to make the vaccines. And yet, there's still some, what should I say, much to be left desired, because maybe the vaccines are the boosters, and how many boosters do we need? And it didn't go quite as well. There's no silver bullet for the vaccine. So, was it best off if we just didn't vaccinate? These are all questions people are wrestling with as the scientific data, and, whether the reports in the media are true that the governments are twisting the data or not releasing the data. I don't know. Could it be said that maybe that we got off better than we could have hoped? That this scenario that we're in now is much better than it could have been. It could have been far worse. But is it predictive? Is it in the Bible? People see a text and they look out the window and then they look and see. And that's how we pretty much got in the Enlightenment. We got to private interpretation of the text. We got away from listening to other voices, and we got to, there's only the voice of reason within us. And I don't see demons flying outside. So therefore, the German theologians who brought on higher criticism don't see demons. And so they begin to wonder that since I cannot see it, then I'm going to interpret the text based on my own ability and reason, and follow science. And there's many people out on YouTube that are atheists because they're following the Bible scientifically and saying, I look outside my window and I look at the text and I read it through the lens that I am, even though this is an ancient text, speaking to an ancient people. And so we have the dichotomy of those that are extreme critics on the left and extreme conservative, fundamental, literal readers on the right, and it must be this. And because of both of those extremes, and they've gotten even more extreme, and the division between people now is such that it's so extreme between the two that there's no middle ground left hardly for people to embrace. And I think it goes back to we've made the Bible something it's not. And so there are those who view the Bible through the lens of dispensationalism, and they see that the Bible talks about different things, and so they compartmentalize those different things, much like people compartmentalize Isaiah into 3 different Isaiahs. Or they move Daniel. And if you move the dating of Daniel, as we talked about in part 3, if you date Daniel differently, then that predictive ability disappears. So then how can someone date Daniel in the 2nd century and not roll it back to, something earlier in the 5th century or 6th century. So how is that possible? And how can prophecy work? And so that needs to be explored. And then you have those that hold different views about the book of Revelation, the coming of Christ. Do we have a rapture? And that's something that was, Darby started relatively just over a century ago, and his writings. And, again, just over a century ago, the whole idea of conservative fundamentalism that came out and as a response during all these crises of World War, Depression, the Spanish flu, and the response that people then had to return to get back to the Bible, and the apathy today that's entirely opposed to that. And so living in our echo chambers and only listening to one voice and my voice and finding people that resonate with what I believe and not listening to anyone else because of my private interpretation and understanding of the text. And so that becomes problematic, and we cannot listen to other voices, and we have blind spots, and we cannot see, and we cannot understand, and it becomes, quite difficult then how we see. And so how can John have written his revelation and it be about Apache helicopters, meaning that what John wrote has nothing to bear on all the centuries before? And it only is, John was only then writing to our century. And I'm reading it. I see Apache helicopters in movies, And then I read the book of Revelation, and Hollywood has done such a good job that then I read it from my perspective, and I cannot read it from an ancient text. And so it becomes dangerous, because then I am being led by the Holy Spirit, and I am seeing the text from my perspective, and I have all these blind spots. And John's not referring to anything in his day. And then we swing again to the other side, whether we're dispensationalists and we compartmentalize everything into these nice little blocks, and we say, well, this is this block, and this is that block, and this is that block. And then again, we talk about the rapture and we talk about that, but then we have these people that believe that Jesus already came. And so we have this perspective on top of it, this idea that there is nothing. In other words, they then read John only from the perspective of John's world, and there was nothing more to it. And that Paul believed and John believed that Jesus was coming, and he did. And they believed that he came in the 1st century, and it's all done. And so you have all these different theories about the book of Revelation: millennialism or amillennialism, pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, and all this, and wondering, what's going on, what is happening. And so the preterists believe that Jesus has already come. Preterism. That there is no prophecy. There is no predictive ability then to the text. It has no predictive ability because it was only talking about those people back then, and it cannot speak to us today. And so you have that extreme. And it kind of reminds me of the cessationists who take a very narrow view of one passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and say, disregarding 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 7, when Jesus, when Paul describes what he's talking about, when Jesus comes back, what he means by the end, what he means by, he's setting up the letter just like he does in all, just like you're supposed to. Like we have movie trailers today, that letters in the 1st century written like Paul would have written, where he would dictate or he would, consult someone to craft this letter for him and say, this is what I want to speak to the Corinthians. And he sets out in chapter 1, verse 7, what he means, and then he later just kind of teases it. And then later on, he grabs onto that same idea in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. But some people ignore the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 7, and say that 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 10, is specifically meaning that, there is no more gifts because we have the Bible today, and that's it. There's no new revelation. And they shut down that everything's done. It's like we cooked it. It's like the concrete. The concrete is set. It cannot then speak to us. There's no more miracles. The miracles were only in the context of the original gospel and the generation singular that followed. And that's it. And so they get this idea that there are no apostles today. There are no prophets today. There is no prophecy today because it's all finished. And because there's a lot of abuse in these areas, even in this present time, then it's easier to hold these views, and that way, down through the ages, all those who claim that God has spoken to them, it can be erased by sweeping it under this new theology that erases everything from the past so that we don't have to worry about the abuses, and everything is nice and neat that way. And so you have preterism, you have cessationism, you have all these ideas that are on one side limiting prophecy to the extent that it only occurred because of Jesus' coming. And God was doing the last thing with Jesus, and he's not doing anything else. And then the fallout from those views, whereas, we're just going to continue on forever until this world ends. And, the idea of deism, that there's a clockmaker and he set the clock and he started it and it's just running on its own. And God has gone off to do his own thing somewhere else. He was the original programmer. He's the original mover, and he started things and got it going, and then he just took off and he's gone. And he doesn't do anything else. He no longer has any bearing on what happens, and we just take what Jesus taught us as a great plan, and we're it. And whatever we do with it, that's what the future of this world holds. And there is no coming judgment. Christ is not coming a second time. There's no rapture. There's no second coming. He already came. It already happened. It's all finished. And it's up to us then to take what Jesus had given as a guide, and that is what maps out the future. You have that idea of prophecy and the fact that the original apostles were there to confirm that Jesus is who he said he was, and that's it. And it's over. And there's nothing else. So again, you have the extremes and trying to wade through all these systems. And when you lock yourself down in the system, and again, like the dispensationalists who have their little epochs or little ages or little dispensations, they can compartmentalize. This is for this time. We can put this saying of Jesus in this little thing for this group, but then it doesn't apply to this next group. But then all the systems begin to have their weaknesses. All the systems begin to break down, where when you take the totality of the text, and if you were to move outside of the text, God forbid, because there are some people who say you cannot move outside of the text. Yet I like how David C. Mitchell in his book Messiah ben Joseph describes the rabbinical literature, in that he says it's not the treasure, it's more like a treasure map that leads to the treasure. So these texts, to me, are not the treasure. And some people have made certain texts the treasure, or made it to such an extent that anything outside of the treasure text have no influence. And I like Mitchell's understanding that they can help guide us on our journey to the treasures if we accept them for what they are and what they can afford us, rather than totally ignoring them. We're not saying that these other texts are holy scriptures or inspired by God. All we're saying is they help us get our perspective right when we consider
what we have in the midst of the surrounding texts that are written in the same period to give us a little bit of an idea, as opposed to the more modern texts where we're so anachronistic and out of that time period that our readings then become problematic.
You know, but yet John does. Paul does. I'm amazed. You know, Paul quotes Greek poets, and, you know, he uses that. And it's very clear, you know, that Jude is quoting from the book of Enoch. What's First Enoch? You know, Jude quotes. It's a direct quote from the book of Enoch, First Enoch. And yet there are those who say, well, you know, scholars who point that out are just wrong. Because anytime you are following a scholar, and I have comments on videos on this channel where people have said that, you know, anytime you have a scholar pointing out that you can look outside the Bible, that's not the Holy Spirit, that's not God, and that scholar's wrong, and they've disdained Dr. Michael Heiser. And again, Dr. Heiser is just simply taking a lot of scholarship and presenting it and saying, here's a way that we could thread through all of that scholarship and come out to read the Bible better. That's it. And all he's doing is trying to introduce people who are outside of the academic world to the academic world and say, by studying scholarship, you could do so much better because they have spent their lifetime digging through all these data points, and they bring it out, and then you can take the fruit of their labors. And, you know, it's like going to a world-class restaurant in one of these, you know, exotic locations, whether it be London or Paris or Rome or New York or whatever, and having the best chef cook you the best food possible, you know, because they have access to the best spices. I remember a pastor who had come out of that culinary world, and he would order spices from around the world, from Peru. You know, he was ordering spices from around the world, from Peru, cooking up some of the most delectable feast and feeding the poor with it, saying, you know, this is not just for the rich. I want to feed the poor because I want them to have a taste of this, you know, and whether, again, you agree or disagree with that. But he didn't think that we should just go cheap, you know, and feed the poor. And there's other people that have a different perspective, and, you know, let's just cut the budget down and let's just feed more people and use less money, and we can then save the money and feed more people. And, you know, and he was buying spices and cooking food that was, you know, using the best spices from around the world. And so that's the kind of idea I'm talking about here. And then you say, no, you know, no, that's not God. That's not the Holy Spirit. That's not what God intended.
The question begs then, how do you know that you're right and they are wrong? And again, we can go to another extreme on the other end and say that because Jude said that this is Enoch who prophesied these things, and we can begin to overly literalize the text and miss the point and not understand that these texts come from this time period in the Second Temple period that reflect the thinking of various strains of Judaism in that time period. And no one in that time period reading it is going to think that this is actual a prophecy written down by Enoch, who comes to us all the way back from Genesis chapter 5. They understand what this is. And so they understood it, but we don't, because we're reading it so much later and we're missing out on the point of the message. And we're trying to change the dating of things and get it all mixed up, and then try to read the text from that perspective, and we have the wrong perspective. We don't have the perspective that they had. And so scholars help us avoid these things by helping us sort out through these various issues and give us a better idea so that we can come away with a better reading. And again, we hope that you enjoyed this part in our prophecy series and will join us next time as we continue this important dialogue. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.